At a global level, we work closely with the UN, and we have observer status with the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. We have a consultative status with ECOSOC, and we are accredited for United Nations Environment Programme. We have 10 offices worldwide, and in this presentation I'll focus mostly on the EU policy issues that we've seen, but also some global issues. So why are attempts to invent plant-based products increasing? Well, the problem is that we are too successful as a movement. As a plant-based sector, the alternatives to meat and dairy are massively increasing, not just in Europe, but also around the world. And these figures may be from 2020 and maybe a little bit old. The next slide as well from the plant-based dairy sector, but we still see an increase. And that is actually a great issue, a great problem to have, you would say. This is good for the market, this is good for consumers, this is good for the planet. So our actually response to this problem is that the plant-based sector is a win-win scenario for meat and dairy producers, and that we would welcome them to enter that market, like Danone or Unilever or Nestlé have done already. They've diversified their portfolio, and they started developing other plant-based products to their conventional meat and dairy products, and they found that it's really lucrative for them. So that's what we see as the solution. However, the meat and dairy industry lobby doesn't see it that way. So what we've seen globally is that they've coordinated tactics to try to undermine the plant-based sector as much as possible. First, they started by using spurious consumer confusion arguments and misleading marketing arguments. They're trying to undermine plant-based labeling by claiming that milk and meat-related terms must contain ingredients of animal origin. They also lobby to disallow any comparisons between natural animal products and plant-based versions, and that applies to any kind of scheme that you can think of. For example, eco-labeling or eligibility for EU promotion funding for agricultural products. They also suggest that meat and dairy are necessary for health, and they're trying to persuade policymakers and nutritionists that plant-based products are ultra-processed and unhealthy. They reject plant-based milks as a valid alternative because it's so-called not nutritionally valid enough, not equivalent to dairy. And they also downplay the flexitarian trends, saying that the numbers of vegans is still relatively small. And they also point out to the unfortunate increase in global meat consumption. They have also changed the public discourse on sustainability. As they've lost some of the arguments I've just mentioned, they've now turned their attention to sustainability and environment. So they suggest that meat and dairy can be even better than plant-based, for example, grass-fed beef. And they represent the sector on all sorts of fora, whether it's Sustainable Food Systems Fora or other think tanks or in any platforms where it can be represented. They claim that livestock actually plays a very important role in climate change mitigation and adaptation. We question that, of course. And they also invest in research on food additives to reduce ruminant enteric fermentation or burping and gases to reduce methane emissions. Again, it's a very marginal, tiny improvement, but a big improvement is needed through the reduction of livestock sector in itself. And finally, they also sponsor research that support their claims and that undermines the globally accepted environmental data on the impact of the livestock sector on the environment, on water use, land use, energy, and greenhouse gases. They're also trying to sow division within the plant-based movement and supporting those that are now claiming that agroecology and regenerative agriculture, etc., have an important role to play alongside the meat and dairy, alongside plant-based solutions. But we are trying to focus on the real issues and where the biggest impact can be made by reducing the livestock sector and by increasing more plant-based meat and dairy alternatives. They're exaggerating the downturn in plant-based alternatives, but there is no such thing. It's all hyped up. And given the international setbacks that they've had, especially say at EU level, they're now trying to change the tactics and the legislation changes at a national level. And finally, they occasionally actually admit that the livestock sector is hurting, that their livelihoods are being threatened by the plant-based foods. But again, if they saw it as an opportunity, they could diversify their portfolio and increase the share. So examples are that they actually use tobacco-type industry tactics to mislead consumers, which is quite a an accusation, but if you look at the studies that have been going on to see what kind of tactics they're using, you could really see some parallels. And it's also the same with the fossil fuel industry. They're using tobacco industry type tactics, and it's all delay, denial, and not focusing on the real solutions. So, what has been our response to this censorship? Well, in general, we have reacted with humor, particularly for social media. That's been fantastic. We use our arguments based on facts. Very important to show the trends that plant-based is still growing. It's a win-win for everyone, and that it has a positive impact on the environment and it's good for health. We also show that surveys demonstrate that consumers are not confused. And we work with other NGOs, with other consumer protection organizations where possible, companies, and also plant-based lobby associations to coordinate joint and complementary action. So we do advocacy and outreach towards politicians and policymakers, and we write letters, we have meetings, we draft common positions to kind of go through the advocacy route and the policy route. And then we also have communications like PR, blogs, social media, petitions, supporter engagement, and that is important to show that there are interested consumers in member states in the European Union. That needs to be shown that it's not just one country, but it's an issue in the wider market. And finally, there's also been some legal challenges by particularly lobby associations and companies, but also sometimes occasionally with consumer organizations, for example in the case of the French decree, South Africa and Turkey. An example of this was the successful Amendment 165 and 171, also known as the veggie burger ban and the plant-based dairy censorship. This came into being in 2019 already, in April, and they voted for a proposal to restrict the names of veggie burgers, veggie schnitzels, veggie sausages, and also severely restrict the kind of packaging and labeling and naming of dairy alternatives. You can't already say plant milk, so they wanted to go even further. What we did was an immediate response. We set up a press release the next day that got picked up in the Netherlands and then further in Europe. We set up a petition immediately in April, May 2019, started gathering petition signatures. We encouraged plant-based food and drink companies to be vocal on this issue. We worked with other NGOs, we shared our press work, and we provided visuals and frequently asked questions and started our advocacy in 2020. So this was the petition 2019. And here's some assets that we developed for social media, including a funny video that's still on YouTube. So the result was that we managed to stop the veggie burger ban. The Amendment 165 was stopped by the European parliamentarians, but that was a great result, of course. We had 275,000 signatures on the petition. A coalition of NGOs worked together, 2 open letters, and we garnered global media attention, which was great, but unfortunately, Amendment 171 did get passed by the European Parliament. So we have to start all over again with a petition and media and an open letter with the European Alliance for Plant-Based Foods, an NGO letter, also signed by Greenpeace and WWF. Again, another campaign, which was slightly different this time because it had already been passed by the European Parliament. But then they are negotiating with the Council, which are the heads of state, and then also the Commission in so-called trilogue. So those 3 parties discuss which proposals do get implemented. And after a few months of campaigning, also getting on board influencers such as Greta Thunberg and the UK environmentalist George Monbiot, we actually managed to get it off the table and reject the plant-based dairy censorship in April 2021. So that's a victory, but it's not the end of the threat towards the plant-based sector. Here are some other visuals that we used in that campaign. But there are still issues globally, and it's also not completely safe yet in the EU. So just to quickly show you where this has come from. So in 1987 already legislation was implemented in the EU to restrict the word milk for only dairy milk. And that wasn't so much an issue for about 30 years until there was an actual case study, where a case law where Tofu Time, the company, tried to claim that their product was an alternative to dairy, and they got struck down in the court by being found guilty of using terminology that was no longer allowed. So that set the precedent in 2017. And emboldened by this, the meat and dairy industry thought, oh good, we can try to restrict it even further and protect our industry. So hence the Amendment 165, 171. And then because that didn't work at EU level, they started working at national level. And of course in France we already saw the French decree, that was a law from 2020 and was supposed to be implemented this October, but actually we managed to work with organizations and companies, and at the request of Protein France, they actually delayed the implementation, and now they're looking at getting it challenged in court because they see that it's not compatible with EU law, and that if this does pass, it would actually be incompatible with EU law and impose certain restrictions that are not actually working. At the same time, there's also a case against Beyond Meat. The Interbev, the meat lobby in France, has lodged a case in 2021 and is now trying to take Beyond Meat to court. So that is another case that they want to get discussed at the European level, because that then could be a precedent for them to get the Amendment 165, the veggie burger ban, adopted through the back door via France, via a national case study. So we are keeping a very close eye on this and working with our friends and organizations there to do what we can. At the moment, it's all behind the scenes. In Belgium, there was also guidance issued to not use those meaty terms for alternatives anymore. So we're also keeping a close eye on that. And in Spain, we managed to avert that kind of restriction. In Turkey, of course, you're very well aware that this implementation of restrictions on vegan cheese has taken place, and that in June 2022 a lawsuit was filed, but that hefty fines have been issued to the plant-based vegan cheese companies and producers, and the products have been seized. So this is all very worrying, and it's much more difficult to kind of combat this, but it probably needs to go through the legal challenge, and also perhaps it's a possibility that defining what vegan products are will help with the actual protection in the future. It could also be that this is being used as an excuse to delay the actual tactics. But again, what we need to show is that the consumers are on the side of the plant-based products. They may not necessarily always be consumers of those products, but may have family or friends, and they may be against the kind of censorship. And that's really important. People are not confused. They are supportive of these products in the transition towards a more plant-based protein world, and they want to support the companies being able to produce these kind of products. A similar thing happened in South Africa just a few months ago, where we also saw restrictions being imposed, and seizure of products was supposed to take place in mid-August, but the Consumer Goods Council of South Africa managed to hold that in court, and that's now pending. Again, they're looking at the merits of the case and challenging this. What was implemented was that restrictions on plant-based egg terms have actually taken place. So the product Just Egg was taken off the shelves, and that cannot be sold at the moment. And in the US, we have seen several states, 26 actually, that have introduced bills that would prohibit meat denominations. And also Dairy Pride Act is an act to protect the dairy industry and restrict the kind of labeling and nominations for plant-based alternatives to dairy. So again, we're working with organizations there, keeping an eye on it and helping a little bit where we can. It's quite difficult with a team of only like 1 or 2 people within Progress focusing on all these global issues, but the key is here that we are knowing what's happening and sharing that information with each other. In the UK, we had a bit of a scare a few months ago, where also via the backdoor, a national trading standards group tried to come up with a very severe interpretation of the EU law in terms of dairy, and that was basically the same as the Amendment 171 that had failed at the EU level. They tried to kind of introduce it via the back door in the UK, and that failed because the ministry was actually not aware and not in favour of this. At the time anyway, but now the government's changed, so we don't know what's going to happen. The threat's not off the table. We need to keep an eye on that. In Czechia and in Italy, they use the French decree as an example of what can or should be done at national level. We've seen some intimidation in Austria. We've seen some dairy censorship in India, Australia. We saw this year and last year introductions of meat restrictions, meat alternative restrictions, and that's still being discussed at government level. And in Chile, there's now also a proposal to restrict the meat alternatives. So it's happening globally. We need to definitely keep an eye on this. Consumers are clearly not confused. I mentioned that there are several studies here that show that they are not. If you're interested, I can tell you more after the presentation. You can get access to the links to the studies. And what we need to do is work together. So we were one of the co-founders of the European Alliance for Plant-Based Foods back in January 2020. This was before the kind of big campaign took off. That was a bit later in August 2020. And we wanted the veg ban to be the first issue to campaign on and to increase the lobby efforts across Europe, to align the lobby efforts with media efforts. Sometimes it helps to add pressure, sometimes it can hurt when you do policy work, and you need to keep that away from the spotlight. You need to find out what is the best time to use advocacy and when it's the best time to include a bit of public pressure through PR. And also we have quite a big network with food industry partners, so we wanted to involve them in that. And actually the goals of the EAPF are on the website for those who are more interested in what the European Alliance does. So some of their work is advocacy related. That's actually the bulk of the work. It includes position statements, letters, meetings with politicians, authorities, making the case for plant-based, and then there's of course stakeholder engagement, where we work with companies and NGOs to show the strength of the plant-based sector, and communication, which we do via social media. And when there's a campaign, there is a bit of a focus on that. But the communication side was, in the case of the AM 165171, more done by the NGOs like ProVeg. And the EAPF is very strong in their network of politicians and the commission, etc. So what we need to do is actually working more together. We may have averted some restrictions, but as I showed you, there's still a threat. They're aligning internationally, so we need to work together to share information, resources, data, and campaign tactics to share this. So not every organization is reinventing the wheel. There's also a threat to potentially cultured meat and dairy, so we need to keep that in mind. And what I also mentioned was that the restrictions are not just aimed at the wording, but also the packaging, the marketing, all sorts of implications. It wasn't even allowed to be sold in the same aisle as milk. All these kind of introduced restrictions amount to censorship in our view. So there's an opportunity. We are now going to work much closer together and harmonize our efforts. We think that the public opinion is on our side. They are against censorship. It's a chance to call out the damaging efforts by the meat and dairy industry. And maybe we have an opportunity to actually lay a foundation of legislation for the cultured and fermented sectors that are now trying to really get a foothold in policy globally. So what we need to do is work together, closely, coordinate. We need to have trust between the partners. We need to try different routes to reach the target groups, as I mentioned before, communications, PR, advocacy, one-on-one meetings with politicians, letters, petitions. Just coming back. We need to be prepared for backlash and counter-arguments, and we need to use multi-layered levels, that everyone needs to be involved, all the different stakeholders. But yeah, we need to also be aware that every context is different, of course. You can't always copy and paste exactly the same tactics everywhere. And what we found is that involving all the different target audiences that are affected around one key message, such as plant-based censorship, has a massive impact. This is something that shows unity, even if there may be some slightly different opinions within the sector. We show that we are united on this issue. And we want to connect consumers, NGOs, food industry on advocacy letters, food industry also in relation to our petition, strengthen that relationship, media, and also get the key policy experts invited on panels, etc. So we really want to reach as many industry and NGO stakeholders as possible to put maximum pressure on politicians and influence them to do the right thing. So let's work together. We can do this. We need to actually try to get censorship off the table globally, create a level playing field, and establish a positive public plant-based narrative. Thank you so much. I hope you have any questions. I'll be here to answer them, or after the presentation following another meeting, and my colleagues will be able to help as well. Also want to thank Lucia, the EU Policy Manager, Elias, the EVU Policy Manager, and my colleague Carly for helping me with this presentation. Thank you so much.